Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. Thank you very much indeed for inviting me to come and talk to you this morning. That is the title, according to the programme, what I'm going to talk to you about. I will try and stick to that. Just for those of you who do not know who BIMCO is, very kindly someone said earlier this afternoon we're the largest of the shipping trade associations and have been around, as you can see from this slide, for a long time. I won't labour the slide here, but read the big bits. We're a global membership, so this is a reminder that we're talking about a global industry and we have a problem that the whole globe needs to deal with when it comes to piracy. We're very much about harmonisation and standardisation of all shipping-related activity. And I need to put this slide up, which helps. We are very much actively promoting the application of internationally agreed regulatory instruments. If anyone wants to talk to me more about BIMCO afterwards, I'd be very happy to do so. What am I going to talk about very briefly is give you a quick strategic analysis and view of piracy from a shipping industry perspective, what we see as the current status quo and the precise position of the industry, its strategy and policies, and very briefly highlight a current issue for the international community to address that I think that you might find very interesting, and conclude with a way forward for the international community. So where does piracy occur? That is in the BIMCO Shipmaster Security Manual we've just updated. If there are any ship owners present or anyone from Confitama, it's available today, the 2013 version. Piracy is occurring this year in all of those areas. It is a global problem. We are very much focusing on Somalia. We shouldn't forget the Gulf of Guinea, but it is a radically different problem. So what is the industry's overarching strategic view? We are extremely worried, and I want you to go straight to the last bullet on this slide, which says piracy, a potential terrorist risk, and it should be addressed by the international community decisively. And why? Half of the bullet before it, unless governments and their naval forces are then prepared to confront possibilities, there is a good chance that piracy could be used as a Trojan horse to achieve terrorist aims. One of our biggest concerns prior to piracy kicking off in around 2005 was that actually the terrorist would use the shipping industry as a Trojan horse. He would use the container as a vehicle to deliver a weapon of mass destruction. This is exactly the same problem, and that is our overarching view of global maritime security, which is why piracy is so important. Stand fast what is going on in Somalia. There is no piracy terrorism nexus in Somalia as far as we are concerned or are realistically aware. The odd penny might change hands, but not a lot, I can assure you. So what is the industry view of the role of the international community when it comes to piracy? Security is inherently governmental, and states fear loss of authority when challenged. So when the industry starts shouting and starts doing its own thing, the perception of sovereign rights rules okay very much comes to the fore from governments. Here we have a nationally sponsored conference being run by the Italian Foreign Office very correctly. But when governments don't actually act, then there is often a breakdown in security. And what if no governments perceive it is in their vital interest to maintain security in order that normal daily business can continue, daily commerce? On the high seas, the shipping interest rights are enshrined in UNCLOS, but sometimes there is seemingly no desire for ownership of UNCLOS. And any abrogation of responsibilities leads to business buying security as the only alternative. The government general excuse is we can't afford it, but we still wish to regulate the alternatives, which actually, I can assure you, frustrates the ship owner just a little. The typical types of security, and as far as the role of the international community is concerned, that have been bought in the past, have been government-sponsored, they've been logistical, and or they're freelance. But what if there is a legal and law enforcement vacuum and not armed conflict per se, which was well spoken about earlier this afternoon? If one then adds, what if there is no vital interest, and the perception that there is no vital interest, then how do you actually come up with some way of running law on the high seas? Having a code of conduct is no value unless it's policed. And who will police it? Indeed, can they be policed on the high seas? A question I would ask you to think very carefully about. If governments don't do it, then it has to be the end user, the ship owner, who has to try and regulate it to avoid abuses, more importantly, to avoid potential liabilities when governments come back at them. Hence why BIMCO produced GuardCon over 2 years ago, to protect the ship owner. That's what it was really all about. So this is business to business, and relationships, as far as business to business are concerned, self-regulate. This is the very real and unavoidable status quo today, which will remain unless piracy is defeated. And I use that word advisedly. It is no good us continuing to talk about deterring and disrupting piracy. We need to defeat piracy. The reason being is that in Somalia, lawlessness ashore equals lawlessness at sea. The law enforcement vacuum has been filled at sea, but on land, much further action is required. As far as the operational status quo is concerned, our perception is the naval resource constrictions imposed by governments is leading where? We get very concerned when we attend the Shade, where, as someone earlier pointed out, we have this great industry and military relationship where we are really communicating and talking about what we can do and how we should do it. But if the assets aren't provided by governments, then we start to worry, because there is no doubt about it. As you heard earlier today, there are 3 pillars to currently deterring and defeating piracy on the high seas, and that is the best management practices, armed guards, and most importantly, the naval presence that is there. If that dwindles, a window of opportunity will arise for the pirate, and we'll go back to square one. Politically, our perception, we have a number of questions. There are a large number of initiatives. Some might say there are a plethora of initiatives. But, how many practical solutions are actually being implemented on the ground today that are actually changing the situation ashore? It is difficult to implement some of the ideas that are banned at the moment, but we need more forceful political interventions. The FAO's paper on fishing, for example, is great to support subsistence fishing so that the locals can keep their fish for a few months longer by the odd shipping company giving a reefer container to feed the fish in. They need a fishing industry, tuna canning plants, and something that's going to persuade those people that Jonathan Lucas put up on the slide, who are all fishermen, to be fishermen, not pirates. So politically, we have our real concerns, and therefore we will continue to lobby very forcefully for the navies to help protect ships at sea until we see radical changes ashore. Finally, financially, we see multiple streams of international funding with differing objectives, coordination and confusion, and indeed delays. So, the fundamental position of the industry, we feel that the right of freedom of passage of the seas, I'm not going to bore you with that, we've discussed it this afternoon ad nauseum, and the UN Security Council resolutions are the responsibility of the international community. The root causes and efforts to change, the solution lies ashore. I think I've just laboured that. But we need a dual track going on. There's a requirement for effective law and Coast Guard. There's a requirement to change the conditions ashore for fishermen or for people so that they don't become pirates. That dual track isn't happening. One steam train is moving very fast. The other one is only just pulling out of the blocks. The third point that we abide by is ransom payments should not be hindered. The ship owner maintains the right to pay ransoms should it be necessary. If he didn't, he'd never get a crew again. I know people don't like it, but that is the way of the world. That is where we are today. You are not going to be able to change that. Otherwise, the only alternative for the ship owner, as was alluded to today earlier, is he will go around the Cape with the absolutely certain effect on inflation. He has to. He has no choice if you ban the payment of ransoms. Finally, we will continue to focus on the best management practices, the use of citizens. The industry will continue to input. We are looking, for example, at a revision of BMP4. We are looking at and have taken significant actions on PMSCs and how to regulate and monitor them in the absence of anybody else doing anything about it. And indeed, what at the same time we're being accused of actually institutionalising armed guards ourselves, we are not doing that. What we want to ensure is that they are regulated so that there are no liability issues, so that the fundamental obligations of international community and flag states, however, are not forgotten. And it is important that that is remembered. And finally, industry will not and cannot fund the counter-piracy effort. We already pay taxes. Why do we have to pay taxes to fight pirates when you have a thing called freedom of passage on the high seas? Our strategy and policy is to actually do all of that at the contact group and IMO at the supranational level, reinforce our support and affirmation for UNCLOS and the role of the international community, look to continue funding where we can, where it is possible, look to the provision of assets and the three pillars, the strongest requirement for the navies to remain there, and look to enhancing those cooperative efforts that have been going so well to date. On the government side, we would encourage governments to continue to prosecute pirates. Initially, there was this throwaway phrase of catch and release because governments were not willing to do this. I would say that that's now going extremely well, but we continue to ask that is done to deter pirates. No one has yet mentioned today, very seldom do people ever mention, I wonder why the pirates are being deterred, apart from being disrupted by the navies, apart from being warned off by armed guards sometimes. It's actually quite possibly a lot of them aren't coming home. There's about 1,000 at the moment locked up in Kenyan jails, and the cousins ashore are thinking, well, where are they? What's happened to them? It is having a deterrent effect, and it's absolutely essential that it continues. As far as the military is concerned, we will continue to maintain dialogue and coordinate. I think the example of the shipping industry and military coordination that has gone on over the last 5 years has not been seen since the Second World War, when that was last achieved. There is a Merchant Navy Liaison Officer permanently embedded in MSC Hoa in Northwood, for example. Then as far as our own work is concerned, the awareness and implementation of the best management practices we continue to bang the table about. We continue to ensure that all vessels apply the best management practices in the high-risk area. Every month I get a list of those vessels who have not complied with BMP. If they are a member of BIMCO, we actually write to them a letter signed by the Secretary-General, asking them why they're not applying the best management practices. And now we have about 80% of vessels reporting transiting through the high-risk area. It's important it stays the same, even though there may have been a reduction in the numbers of attacks. We may not need to call it high risk any longer, but vessels must be prepared because the risk still remains. And not on this slide. Now, I was a little concerned that one or two of the presentations are saying, well, it's actually getting much better now. We are fighting against complacency here. And actually, the worst culprit is probably the ship owner. And so I spent a lot of time reminding him that between the 11th of October and the 16th of November last week, there were 3 attacks on vessels, there were 4 disruptions by naval forces, and 4 suspicious activities. They are still out there, they're still operational, and there is still a problem. It is much less, but it's still there, and the last 4 weeks have proven that quite unequivocally. We will continue to work hard on our own self-regulation of armed guards and private maritime security companies, the use of GuardCon, and indeed something that BIMCO is about to do is actually allow those well-qualified private maritime security companies who become ISO 28007 certified, a little bit more on that in a second, to become associate members of BIMCO. Set a thief to catch a thief. We want to have some handle on these organisations and insist on the very highest of standards. And just as organisations like ours produce a white list for flag states, you can't get more politically sensitive than that, we will produce a white list of bona fide private maritime security companies. And in that way, the ship owner knows what he's getting and that it's right and that the best practices possible are being followed, that are legitimate and they're following all the laws that are essential. We will continue to advocate for the use of citadels and we will continue very much to advocate for the importance of information sharing, particularly under that subject I call the making sure we get witnesses into courts to prosecute pirates. The shipping industry is doing its business. I actually often go and look for masters of vessels who can be the other side of the world a year later to get them to the Seychelles, to get them to Nairobi, to act as witnesses to prosecute pirates. What we always wanted was clarity and standards. We think that signpost, a lot of the flags on it are beginning to fall off it now, and we're quite happy, but we cannot afford to be complacent. 2 minutes. But things can go wrong, and they do go wrong. A difficult joke to read. This is about a warship who stopped the pirates, gave them food and water, explained their human rights, and guess what? They dumped the crew on a desert island. The same thing could happen unless we're careful with ISO 28007. It's guaranteed to raise standards and drivers. It's my takeaway to you. It does everything it says on the box as far as the bullets on this slide are concerned, but there is a need for one common standard to be enshrined in some form of global soft law where currently a vacuum exists. An UNCLOS is not inadequate, but it is indeed quite probably it needs some support, it needs some definition, and work is going on, believe it or not, within UNICRI to try and achieve that. Some real challenges. The focus has been on piracy, but it's the lessons learned from here that we need to apply in the future. How to increase domain awareness and information sharing is possible. RECAP in the Far East and the IMB have been doing it for some time. The MTISC being set up in the Gulf of Guinea is an example of how this can continue. How do we enhance cooperation, coordination, integration? SHADE proves it is possible. How do we create binding single standards? We need to do it through the one organisation that the industry recognises as primus inter pares for all regulation, the International Maritime Organisation, who, when they do not have the technical skills to be able to do that, rely on the International Organisation of Standards. How do we increase maritime capacity building efforts in weak and failed coast states? We have to ask the international community, governments, to identify what their vital interests are to ensure that happens. Because if we don't, then we won't be able to capitalise on the effective and efficient partnerships that are the key solution that have developed from this piracy situation. There will be significant disruption of commerce. It's clearly seen that it's easily possible, and the more globalised the problem, the more exposed we are. Remember that slide of where it occurs all over the world to all our various vulnerabilities. Thank you very much.